An army of 11,000 men is running. In 70 pounds of bronze armor, they are sprinting a full mile across open ground, directly at an enemy more than twice their size. This wasn't strategy, it was suicide. So why did they do it? And how did this single, desperate charge save the world as we know it? To understand that suicidal gamble, you first have to understand the terrifying force they were running towards. The year is 490, before the Common Era. The Persian Empire was the first global superpower, a behemoth stretching from the Indus River to the shores of Libya. It wasn't just a kingdom, it was the known world, a mosaic of conquered peoples, all paying tribute and bowing to one man, Darius the Great, the King of Kings. His power was absolute, his wealth was legendary, and his network of spies, the infamous King's Eyes and Ears, ensured his will was law. To his subjects, he was not merely a monarch, he was a divine figure, the chosen of the gods. And in the heart of his vast empire, Darius was angry. Years earlier, the tiny, troublesome city of Athens had committed an unforgivable crime. In a gesture of solidarity with fellow Greeks, they had helped burn a Persian city. It was a minor rebellion on the far western fringe of his world, but in the gilded halls of Persepolis, news of this defiance was an intolerable outrage. To Darius, whose authority was unquestioned, it was a personal insult that burned hotter than the city itself. He swore an oath of vengeance, and legend says he had a servant whisper in his ear at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." His memory was long, and his retribution was always total. For years, the gears of his empire turned with a single purpose. Messengers on swift horses galloped down the royal road, carrying orders to governors in every province. From the mountains of Bactria to the floodplains of Egypt, a logistical miracle of imperial power began to unfold. It was the gathering of a storm, a deliberate and terrifying spectacle. Now, the time for remembering was over. The force Darius assembled was a projection of his absolute power. Modern estimates place the invasion force at a terrifying 25 to 35,000 men, a tide of humanity designed to crush and to awe. At its core were the elite Persian immortals, backed by disciplined infantry and archers from across the globe, whose arrows were said to be so numerous they could block out the Sunday. They were a professional force that had never known true defeat, a military machine that had ground entire kingdoms into dust. Before the swords were drawn, came the messengers. They traveled to every Greek city-state with a simple, chilling demand, a gift of earth and water, a symbolic gesture of total submission. To accept was to become a servant of Persia, to refuse was to be erased. Many cities, having heard tales of the empire's wrath, saw the futility of resistance. They bent the knee, but in Sparta, the messengers were thrown down a well, and in Athens, they were cast into a pit. There would be no submission. But in making that choice, they had just signed their own death warrant, and the invasion was about to begin. The great fleet moved, an inexorable crawl across the Aegean Sea, guided by a man who knew Athens better than anyone, Hippias, the city's exiled former tyrant. He chose their landing spot, a wide, flat beach perfect for the Persians' ultimate weapon, their cavalry. The bay was called Marathon. The jaws of the Persian Empire were now closing on the birthplace of democracy, and all that stood in its way was a city at war with itself. While the world's greatest army made camp on their shores, the citizens of Athens were not sharpening swords. They were locked in a war of words. The real battle for Athens began not on the plains of Marathon, but on a dusty hill in the heart of the city called the Pnyx, the crucible of its radical new experiment. Democracy. Here, any citizen could speak, but this freedom had become a prison of indecision. The air was thick with fear. A pragmatic general likely stood and voiced the thoughts of many. Miltiades asks you to gamble the lives of every man, woman, and child on a single desperate battle. I ask you to trust our walls, walls that have protected us for generations. Let the Persians break themselves against our stone, not against our bodies. To march out is to seek death. To stay is to choose life. Into this chaos stepped Miltiades. He was one of 10 generals, but he was different. For him, This wasn't a strategic debate, it was personal. He had once ruled a Greek city in the north, under the shadow of Persian authority. He had attended their courts, spoken their language, and seen their methods up close. He knew that their promises were tools of conquest, and that their mercy was a fiction reserved for stories. He had seen what happened to cities that trusted Persian words. For him, the memory of friends executed and allies sold into slavery was a ghost he had been running from his whole life. Now, that ghost had followed him home. He argued with the desperate fire of a man who had seen the future. "The Persians are masters of siege warfare," he would have roared. "Those walls you trust will become our tomb. They will strip the countryside bare and starve us into submission. And when our gates finally fall, do not look for mercy. There will be none." He knew hiding was simply choosing the place of their death. The only chance, he argued, was to do the unthinkable, to march out and meet the beast head-on, on their own terms. The assembly was deadlocked, 5 generals for staying, 5 for marching. The city was paralyzed. This single, fragile idea of democracy was on the verge of being extinguished. If you believe stories like these, about the moments that defined our world, are worth telling, make sure you subscribe to our channel for more. With the vote paralyzed, the fate of the Western world would come down to the decision of a single, undecided man, the Polemarch, or War Archon, a man named Callimachus. Miltiades made his final, passionate plea. "It is in your hands, Callimachus," he would have said, "to either bring slavery upon Athens, or, by ensuring her freedom, to leave behind for all future generations a memory more glorious than any other." He spoke of the choice between living for a single day as a free man or for a lifetime as a slave. Before the final vote was cast, Athens made one last desperate appeal for help. They sent their finest runner, Phidippides, on a grueling 140-mile journey to Sparta. This was a mission of pure desperation. He ran for 2 days and 2 nights, his feet shattered on the sun-baked rock and treacherous mountain passes. Legend says that in his exhaustion-fueled delirium, he was visited by the god Pan, a testament to the sheer, otherworldly effort of his journey. He finally stumbled into the stark, austere city of Sparta, a breathless, dust-caked messenger of panic in a land of rigid discipline. The Spartans, the most feared warriors in Greece, listened patiently. They were sympathetic, but they could not help. Their sacred laws forbade them from marching until the full moon, due to a religious festival. They would be a week too late. The news was a death blow. Athens was completely and utterly alone. And now, one man had to make a choice that would either save them or doom them forever. The vote was cast. Callimachus sided with Miltiades. The decision was made. They would march. An army of 10,000 citizen soldiers, joined by 1,000 brave allies, walked out from the safety of their walls to face an empire. For 8 long days, 2 worlds stared at each other across a mile of open ground. The silence was a war of its own. By day, the heat was suffocating, the sun beating down on bronze helmets and making the air shimmer. By night, a nervous chill settled over the Athenian camp. Small fires flickered, casting long shadows as men spoke in hushed tones of the families they had left behind. The Persian camp was a city of confidence. The Greeks could see the endless tents, hear the sounds of a dozen languages, and watch the smoke from thousands of cooking fires rise into the sky. It was a display of effortless, arrogant power. From this city, Persian scouts on horseback would occasionally ride close to the Greek lines, shouting taunts and insults, reminding them that Sparta wasn't coming, that their city was defenseless, that their end was near. It was a relentless psychological assault, designed to break their nerve before the battle even began. The citizen soldiers, farmers, and potters and stonemasons gripped their spears and watched, their initial resolve tested by the agonizing weight. Miltiades knew morale was a weapon as critical as any spear. He walked the lines constantly, his presence a calming force. He sent out his own skirmishers into the no-man's land, creating small, violent clashes that kept his men sharp and reminded the Persians that they were not facing cowards. He held councils of war every night, countering the arguments of the wavering generals, holding his fragile coalition together by sheer force of will. He knew the Persians held all the advantages. They had more than double the infantry, archers who could rain down death, and thousands of horsemen. The Athenian army had only the hoplite, a citizen soldier encased in 70 pounds of bronze armor. Together, in a formation called the phalanx, they were a human battering ram. Miltiades knew this was his only advantage, but he also knew the Persian cavalry could sweep around his flanks and tear the phalanx apart. He couldn't attack. He couldn't retreat. For 8 days he waited, a predator watching for one sign of weakness, one mistake. And then he saw it. The one thing that could give them a fighting chance. A flurry of activity near the shore. Men and horses moving not towards the Greek line, but towards the ships. The Persian cavalry was being loaded onto the transports. It was a mistake of arrogance, a fatal underestimation of his opponent. What do you think is the biggest blunder a commander has ever made in history? Let us know in the comments below. The Persian commander, Datis, had made a bold gamble. He was sending his cavalry by sea to attack the undefended city of Athens, believing the Greek infantry pinned at Marathon was too terrified to move. He was wrong. Miltiades realized this was his one and only chance. The Persians' greatest weapon was temporarily off the board. The window of opportunity would only be open for a few hours. The time for waiting was over. The order to attack was given, not with a grand trumpet blast, but with a quiet, steely command. And then, the unthinkable happened. The Greeks began to sing their paean, a thunderous, defiant war chant that rolled across the plain. An entire army of 11,000 men in heavy bronze armor began to run. The ground shook with the rhythm of their pounding feet. From the Persian lines, it looked like collective suicide. But Miltiades' charge was calculated genius. By running, the Athenians would cross the killing field of the Persian archers in less than half the time. A hoplite, running in full armor, was a terrifying sight, a living avalanche of bronze. The sky darkened with arrows, but the storm was brief. The Athenians crashed into the Persian lines with the momentum of a tidal wave. The impact was a cataclysm of splintering wood, screeching metal, and human agony, the sound of two worlds colliding. And here, Miltiades' true strategy was revealed. He had deliberately thinned his center and packed his flanks deep and strong. As the fighting raged, the Athenian center buckled as planned, and the elite Persian troops surged forward into the gap, tasting victory. But it was a trap. The powerful Greek flanks, having crushed their counterparts, turned inward. The envelopment was complete, a closing fist of bronze and steel. The conquerors were now the conquered, packed into a killing zone so tightly they could barely lift their weapons. It became a meat grinder of spear and shield, a suffocating chaos where men fought not for yards of ground, but for inches, for their next breath. After their long spears broke, the Greeks drew their short swords, the xiphos, and a terrible, intimate butchery began. Panic, the most contagious of all battlefield diseases, began to spread. The invincible army of the great king shattered. They threw down their weapons and ran, a terrified mob fleeing back to their ships. The pursuit was relentless. The fighting spilled onto the beach and into the shallows of the bay, where desperate men fought in the blood-stained surf. Athenians, with a primal fury, grabbed hold of the escaping ships, trying to drag them back to shore. It was here that the Polemarch Callimachus, the man whose vote had made this battle possible, was killed, fighting to the very last. The impossible had happened. The battle was won. In the eerie silence that followed, the Athenians stood in shocked disbelief amidst the carnage. The beach was littered with the wreckage of an empire's ambition, broken weapons, abandoned standards, and the bodies of over 6,000 of their enemies. Miltiades looked upon the scene, the grim arithmetic of war. He saw not just the victory, but the cost. 192 of his own citizens lay dead, heroes who had bought this victory with their lives. But there was no time to mourn. As they stared at the proof of their incredible achievement, they saw the remaining Persian ships on the horizon, not sailing for home, but rounding the Cape, their sails set for Athens. The battle was won, but the war was not. As the last of the Persian ships fled the shore, a horrifying realization dawned upon the exhausted Greeks. The enemy fleet was not sailing for home. It was sailing for their city, which stood completely undefended. Datis's gamble had failed on the battlefield, but it could still succeed. The victory at Marathon would mean nothing. A new kind of battle had begun, a desperate race against time. What followed was one of the most incredible feats of endurance in military history. The Athenian army, after fighting a brutal, exhausting battle, did not rest. They turned, and they began to march. 26 miles of hard, hilly terrain separated them from their homes. Every step was agony. Bronze armor chafed raw wounds. Thirst was a fire in their throats. But with every painful step, they pictured the faces of their wives and children in a city that was still in mortal danger. That thought, that love, was the fuel that drove them on when their bodies had nothing left to give. As the army marched, the legend was born. The story is told of the runner Phidippides, who ran the final leg to Athens, a single desperate spirit carrying the news of victory. He burst into the city assembly, where the old men and youths waited in terror, his body pushed beyond all mortal limits. With his last breath, he uttered a single word, "Nike, victory," before collapsing to the ground, dead. His heroic run stands as a symbol of the army's own superhuman effort. It was one of the most decisive moments in history, a victory of the human spirit. If this story moved you, share it with someone who appreciates tales of incredible courage. Hours later, the Persian fleet rounded the final headland and arrived at the Bay of Athens. Datis and the traitor Hippias stood on the decks of their ships, expecting to see a panicked city ready for the taking. Instead, as the morning haze burned off, they saw a sight that must have frozen the blood in their veins. There, on the hills above the city, was a line of gleaming bronze shields, reflecting the morning Sunday. It was them, the same men. The hoplites of Athens were already there, waiting. The psychological blow was absolute. The Athenians had not only won the battle, they had won the race. Datis did not even attempt a landing. The sight of that impossible army was enough. He gave the order, and the great invasion fleet turned its prows toward Asia and began the long, humiliating journey home. The victory at Marathon was more than a military upset. The freedom bought that day, in the blood and sweat of that 26-mile march, would fuel the minds of Socrates and Plato and shape the very foundations of Western thought. The world they built was only possible because, for one desperate day, an army of citizens dared to run toward a battle they should have lost. It is a living echo, ringing out over 2,000 years later, proving that history isn't always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest hearts. Thanks for watching. To see more stories about the battles that forged our world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.